I'm not having to sit in the front row.
Oh, wait.
Echo?
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of little changes. They make a sound. I mean, to me, it's like,
Yeah.
But there was somebody else. It's familiar though.
He does like bars. Because he likes
Your daughter just started high school, right? That's
There are a few seats here. There's one here, and you can sit on the steps, I believe. You can sit on the steps. Is that right? Also, it's okay for them to be on the steps?
Yeah.
Okay. We can occupy the steps there, where you are, yeah? And we have a few seats here if you want to come over here. Great turnout. Thank you, everyone. This is unreal. Right, Michael? It's unreal.
And then I'll hand.
All right. So, welcome to the second annual Michael Kyte Distinguished Lecture. This is wonderful and a wonderful venue. I hope you appreciated the bit of food that we could offer and of course the fresh air. And we have that fresh air for the rest of the talk, which I think is just makes me feel like we're in California. Right, Michael? Yeah. My name is Patricia Colbert. I'm chair of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and if you don't recognize that department name, it's because it's a little new. We are and environmental now as of July 1st. This lecture has been established by the department to celebrate the extraordinary career of Michael Kyte. Each year, the faculty invite a distinguished lecturer, someone outstanding in the field of transportation engineering, to give a public lecture, to meet with faculty, to meet with students, and in this case, to actually take a bike ride towards the very controversial section of town known as the 3rd Street Bridge Project. Is that right? We're so pleased to have Peter Koonce here from Portland. He's no stranger to campus. By Wayne Kilson that's on the website, and it'll remain there. So if you're interested in today's topic and you want to know what the lecture last year was, feel free to go to our website and listen to that lecture. We also have several people joining us via Zoom today. That's new for us. We welcome all of you out there in the ether. You can look for virtual hors d'oeuvres in your inbox. We have some special guests here I'd like to recognize, mainly those who are from out of town. Professor John Finney, where are you, John? John is a former civil engineering faculty member, and he now resides in Boise. Professor Rhonda Young is here. Yeah, she's very shy. She's in the front row. Rhonda is a professor at Gonzaga University and has worked with Michael and other faculty at the University of Idaho for several years, and was my colleague at the University of Wyoming. And we actually moved to the Pacific Northwest, or shall we say the Inland Northwest, the same year. So welcome, Rhonda. Greg Smith is here. He came from Spokane, an old friend of Michael's, and I'm not supposed to know much more. And he's here. He dressed appropriately for the day. I'm wearing black, and I'm sweating, and he's wearing shorts, so it looks cool and collected. I can't say no more than that because he's an interesting character. I'd like to welcome Dr. Linda Paul. There she is. Linda's actually running for mayor. She's a former faculty member in the School of Law.
No, yes, here, but primarily as coordinator of business law at Washington.
Business law at Washington State University. So welcome, Linda. And as did I already say, she's running for mayor of Moscow. Walter Steed is here. Walter, there you are in the red shirt. He's a member of the Moscow City Council, and welcome. And I know there are other people interested in this situation. Right? And one last,
Also right.
running for re-election. We're only going for mayors here today. I want to make a special welcome to a new temporary member of our faculty, Professor Mohamed Badran. Where are you? Mohamed is here for the year. He comes to us from the University of Innsbruck, and he's on sabbatical with us for the entire year. So welcome to the University of Idaho. So let me tell you about Michael Kyte. And if you were here last year, you heard these more or less same words, but they're worth repeating. Things like Michael was born in LA. Michael Kyte was born in Los Angeles, where he first developed his interest, he claims, in transportation by watching planes land at LAX. I don't think he was interested in them taking off, which is why he didn't become an aerospace engineer. He received his bachelor's degree in systems engineering from UCLA, where he often also, he told me this, organized dinners between engineering students and engineers in industry or in practice. The topic was overshadowed with discussions of the Vietnam War, and of course, appropriately, UCLA, talking about John Wooden's chances of winning yet another NCAA championship. After UCLA, Michael moved a little bit north to Berkeley. He took his master's degree in civil engineering there at the University of California, Berkeley. Then he spent around 10 years, more or less, in the Portland area, where our speaker is from, where he learned that the public is critical to the success of any public project. He left Portland and headed to Iowa City, where he received his PhD in civil engineering from the University of Iowa, applying what he learned about public transit systems in Portland to his dissertation research. I tried to find the title or a copy of his dissertation. Failed, because of course, not everything was online, but next year I will present the title of his dissertation. It was not in your CD. During his last semester at Iowa, a life changed. He met his wife, Marty Ford, who's in the row in front of us. She was studying mechanical engineering, and they were taking a course. Both of you taking it, or were you teaching? Years. I think just shy of 30 years. He retired in December of 2015, and for about 15 of those 30 years, he actually served as director of NIATT, our Transportation Research Center here at the University of Idaho. In retirement, Professor Kyte continues his interest in understanding how intersections work. My joke from last year was, don't we all? Particularly traffic signal control systems. He's also found time to pursue his love of playing the cello, and I hope it's okay that I mention that. Michael's the author of 2 books on intersection operations, and maybe is working on a third. I think he's playing a lot of cello. But, it's my distinct pleasure to ask Michael Kyte to join me just for a moment to welcome you here, our mentor, our friend, and our colleague. Michael, come on up. Thank you all. And now I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to ask Michael Lowry if he would introduce today's speaker. And at the end of Peter's talk, we'll have a small presentation, so if you just stay for a few minutes after this.
Welcome, everyone. Pleased and honored to introduce Peter, a friend and colleague
And as I've been advertising today's presentation in the community, I've been saying, you need to come hear this national leader, Peter Koonce, talk about city engineering and city planning. And as I printed out his bio this morning, I think you'll see that you won't be disappointed with that claim of him being a national leader. Just as I read this, count how many times I say the word national here. When I list the committees he's a member of. So Peter Koonce works for the City of Portland as the manager of the Division of Signals, Street Lighting, and Intelligent Transportation Systems. He is responsible for an annual budget that exceeds $13 million and oversees 43 professionals working in his division. He has served as an adjunct professor at Portland State University, teaching graduate level courses in transportation engineering. He is a member of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. For those of you who have never heard of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, this is the national committee that decides what our road signs and road painting markings should look like. And you might think, haven't we figured that out yet? But each year there's something new that's being presented to us, and so we have to think of what should the signage look like, how big the letters should be, what should the paint markings be. And Peter is on a committee that makes those decisions for us as a national standard. He was appointed as chair of the National Academies of Science Committee on Traffic Signal Systems. And this is a committee that decides the national direction for research related to traffic signals. And this is a committee that he has chaired, continues to chair, is chairing now. And I believe, Michael Kyte, you've been a member of that committee, right? Traffic Signal Systems. Okay, and then he is an active member of the National Association of City Transportation Officials. This committee, NIATT is the acronym, and is a very interesting and exciting organization with a very forward-thinking effort to tackle today's transportation issues. And they've produced a lot of really exciting work, and I have a feeling that Peter will probably discuss some of the work he's done with NIATT today in his presentation. Peter is a board member of the Bicycle Transportation Alliance. He participates with various professional societies, including the Institute of Transportation Engineers and the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals. And then I will just add that within the transportation community, many people have recognized Peter as one of the most progressive transportation engineers in the country. And then talking with him today, I wanted to note in his words that he has dedicated his life to improve safety for multimodal travel. I think we'll find his presentation exciting, interesting, and a lot to learn from him. So we thank you, Peter, for being here.
Well, thank you, Michael. I sent Michael a bio. I said, well, just keep it short, whatever you do. So I'm not sure you're listening to instructions. Well, I wanted to say I'm deeply honored to be here. It's really, I was humbled by the request when Ahmed sent me the email saying, would you mind coming back to Moscow? And I didn't really hesitate with the opportunity to really follow in the footsteps of one of my mentors, Wayne Kittleson, who gave the first lecture, and then to essentially provide the second distinguished lecture for Michael Kyte. I will talk a little bit about my relationship with Michael and some of the past experiences I've had, and I'm really honored to be here. I talked to Mike about the presentation a bit, and he said, I'll show you the title that I had proposed, and he said, well, no, let's make it bigger. We need some ideas that Moscow can really grow from. So how about designing cities in the 21st century? And I said, oh, that's a good title. And he said, how about, and then we'll talk about what we know with what we need. And it's like, okay, let's see. Do I really know what you need? And so I said, well, let me just do this. I will say what I know and what I think we need as we're designing our cities. So I'll start off by going into the presentation and talking a little bit about my personal background. try to get into some inspirational topics. Just because there are students here, it'll leave you with a little sliver of technical knowledge, maybe a bit of practical perspective, because I want to make sure we're not just in the ivory tower and talking about how wonderful the university and research is. And then because, again, there are students here, there'll be a quiz, so pay attention. I know as an adjunct faculty, I have to give a quiz if I'm going to get anybody to pay attention. And I'm really started my career as a student at Oregon State University. So just tell you a little bit about me. And I was, I'm really a product of my father. My father was a veteran of the Air Force and was right in between the Korean and Vietnam War. So he never had those debates about the Vietnam War. But I'm certainly a product of my father's influences. He was a draftsman. And never went to college. And so if he was ever going to be a success in his life, he was going to have his kids go to college and graduate from college. In fact, I think my one disappointment I have that he has with me is that I didn't get my PhD, because he always held people. Relationships we've had with Kittleson, so it is a distinct honor. And then working for different clients as a Kittleson employee, and then back at the city of Portland. So who do I work for now? Well, I think about the city, and I think about these are the two most important residents in the city of Portland. I used to say the mayor, but over the years, I know that I only really work for Abby on the left and Amelia on the right, and as I said, they're 14, 11-year-old. My 14-year-old, my 11-year-old. And so this is our design vehicle in Portland. So you think about your user of the roadway. We want to make sure that they are taken care of and that they can access the world by bike, by walking, by bus. So in this notion of this era of design, we think about safety as the number one thing in Portland. So it's this notion of Vision Zero, which is something I've learned from European experiences, not just from the practice that we've had in the last 40 years. So I'll talk quite a bit about that. And one of my experiences, you can see they're both wearing helmets. So they're both pictures in Portland. We've taken them to the Netherlands on a study abroad that I do at Portland State. In the Netherlands, they don't wear helmets because they don't feel, and we don't feel, that it's unsafe for them to bike around. So this is the difference, of course, between the US and the Dutch practice, is that they design facilities a bit differently. We'll talk a little about that. So going back to this theme, so I'll sprinkle in, of course, personal elements as a part of this. But going back to the theme of the talk, how do we know what we know, and how do we know what we need if we're designing for these new users? We didn't always design for these new users. When I started my career, I was working to try to optimize the flow of traffic. I wasn't thinking as much about safety as I do today. And that's really a strange and exciting trend, is when you learn a lot in school and then you get presented with something like this, which isn't in our guidebooks, it isn't in our textbooks. But this was the answer to a problem we had in a semi-trailer. In the other case, just turned right into the path of a cyclist, killing them instantly. So in those problems, that's a problem that as engineers 4 solutions there. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to focus on my talk on 3 different themes. Okay. He appreciates cyclists. So he did, one of our city commissioners, he said, I don't ride a bike, but I appreciate cyclists because when I see someone riding their bike on the road, what I think about is that as that person rides their bike, all of our costs for health insurance are lower as that person is getting healthier. And so that's part of one of the, no, my clicker doesn't work. All right, technology is great when it works. So the climate action plan is that next level of thinking that we have in Portland, trying to wrap all this stuff together, trying to figure out where we go with our goals. And as a transportation engineer, one of the things that I do with these plans is I read them and enjoy the lovely prose associated with them. But as an engineer, I also, as I was talking to several of you before, I really do love to get into the numbers. And so the numbers in Portland are this. In our current commute mode split, the way in which people get to work, 66% of the population drives alone, 8% of the people bike, 4% walk, 8% carpool, and 15% transit. As we thought about the moving forward and how we would get people to where they want to go, we thought, well, gosh, we don't have that much money. We need to think creatively about these climate action goals and the lack of resources. And so what we came up with was, if we're trying to meet our climate goals, how might we do that? And one of the reasons to encourage people to ride their bikes is that it's a very efficient use of space. And so if we think about the future and what we can do if we put our minds to it, is we can meet our climate action goals if we get 25% of the people biking to work. So tripling the number of people biking, doubling the number of people walking, and increasing the number of people that take transit to 25%. So you can say, well, Peter, that seems like a really, really tough goal to meet. And the answer is, yes, it is. And the question is, well, Peter, 25%, that's like on par with the Netherlands. How would you ever get there? And I'd say, well, it's a goal that we may not meet. We may not get to 25% bike mode split in 2030. But what it does, so it's a goal that we may not meet, but what it does do is when I do have resources from which to build new transportation facilities, it points me in the right direction towards building transportation facilities that are focused on the overall goals of the city. Not just perpetuating the same thinking that we've had in the past 10, 20, 30 years. So really trying to get us on a path towards a more multimodal future. And that's really very powerful for engineers as we think about design. So as you contemplate that, that's a big challenge to meet, at 25% bike mode split target. And it's not just about the infrastructure, it's not just what I do, it's all encompassing in the city, it's about encouraging people. So as you think about, can we meet that goal? If somebody were asking that question, can I get to 25% bike mode split by myself? The answer is, no, I can't. I know nothing, and I know too much. I know nothing about those other parts, the education parts, the encouragement parts. I know too much about the engineering parts. I can get us there, I can design those facilities because I have the relationships with people in the Netherlands, people in San Francisco, people in other cities that are doing these great things. But it's the other part, the relationships on the encouragement and education side, where I don't have all the answers. So that is really important to recognize and solve those problems. Recognize the problems that you can challenge the conventional thinking on, and then get to work solving those problems. So let me just back up a little bit and talk about my background again, and think about where we are. We're in a university, you're learning, many of you are learning about civil engineering. And my love for civil engineering was really started in thinking about building bridges. Just as Mike was watching planes come into LAX, I was thinking about the Golden Gate Bridge or the St. John's Bridge in Portland, and thinking I wanted to grow up to be a bridge builder. And then I learned a little bit more about those bridges and was looking for a job, and I found that traffic signals was a job that was just right out the side of the door. And so I took that job. But if you think about civil engineering and where we started from, you know, one of the things that we know with bridges, with water systems, and soil and foundations, and we're taught with roads and rail, is that we never want any of those systems to fail. So if you think about the definition of failure, clearly this is a definition of failure. The Skagit River Bridge, that I-5 crash that happened with the semi hitting one of the girders, that was a structural engineering failure with that crash. Now, if you extend that in civil engineering, of course, the bridges, you can think about aerospace engineering with Apollo 13. Of a Jeopardy question, so you're supposed to sing the theme song now. So, let's take traffic level service 101 for $100. I should put Mike on the spot here, and I see if he'll answer it. So highway capacity manual, so thinking about failure, defining failure, the highway capacity manual defines failure as the breakdown of flow. This is the threshold where you reach failure to signalize intersections. What is that value? Anybody? Mike? Delay of 80 seconds per vehicle. Okay, that's what signalized intersections chapter in the highway capacity manual talks about. Delay of 80 seconds per vehicle. Okay. So can we all agree that seems like a reasonable definition for failure? Why might it not be the best definition for failure if you're designing a 21st century city? If you're designing for that mode split that I was describing as a part of the Portland City Climate Action Plan. Well, the challenge is that we're talking about vehicles. It's just vehicles. When I say vehicles, I'm not talking about bikes. The problem is that we're not talking about the delay for pedestrians. And in Portland, we have to think more than about the vehicle. If you're thinking about that climate action plan, if you're thinking about trying to get people on their bikes, if we're letting the cars go by and having them speed by and making cars the fastest mode by far, then it's not the right measure. If you think about our streetcar and trying to get people that are living near where they work and take the streetcar instead of giving them their cars, that's certainly vehicle delay in the classic sense of just automobiles is not quite the right measure. We should be prioritizing transit. We should be thinking about how pedestrians are being inconvenienced by traffic signals. And so that's part of that is that we, as a part of the highway capacity manual, we think about pedestrians sometimes as impediments to traffic flow. They're getting in the way of cars, get them out of there. We'll eliminate a crosswalk to make the car flow better. And so that's some of the challenges of challenging that conventional thinking. And maybe what you're learning in your classes in civil engineering. So thinking differently, especially if your city goals are to create a more well-rounded, multimodal environment. We've got to think differently than we have in the past. So the question is are we changing? Are we evolving? And I think the answers are, well, not quite yet. Some of that research is being done. It's best practices in Florida. Is Florida applicable in Portland, Oregon? Maybe not, and I'll talk a little more about that. So let me just shift gears about and talk more broadly rather than just about signalized intersection delay, which I could talk about for hours and hours, as Mike and I have enjoyed several conversations about that, and talk more broadly about congestion. What is congestion? Right. So if you're sitting at that traffic signal, that's congestion. If you're in the Netherlands and you come out of the main train station, this is a form of congestion. Can you find your bike in that mess of bike parking? And in the Netherlands, they are trying to address this by helping organize those bikes so that you can actually find your bikes in that mess. So in Portland, we have a transportation hierarchy, and this is unique. I think it was unique. It's been adopted by many cities now, a green transportation hierarchy where we are putting pedestrians and prioritizing them at the top of this inverted pyramid, bicycles, secondary, public transit, commercial vehicles, and then saying, single occupancy vehicles, we can We can have them access the city, but we're not going to make it so that single occupant vehicles compromise the experience for somebody walking or biking. And that's a definite change in the way we've thought in the many, many years that I've been now in the profession. So as you think about these various documents, these various references that we've used over time, one of the challenges that we have in the next 20 years is to think about rewriting those to a more multimodal perspective. And I don't have time, of course, to go into many of these, but I will talk a bit about some of the things that we've done with the Urban Street Design Guide. So one of the things I've enjoyed in my career is helping to work on these sorts of documents. Sometimes on my free time, sometimes as I can throughout the day, but thinking about how we change the way we're thinking about designing our cities. And part of that is thinking about the various design controls. How do we change the fundamental assumptions we're going to use? Because these design controls should work towards our intended outcome and not against it. Sometimes we think we want a better city, but we're really perhaps designing for cars, which may or may not make a better city. So think about, what are we designing for? What year of traffic are we projecting to? It's been often the trend to go towards a 25-year horizon, when in reality what we're seeing with the data is that the projections, those straight line growth projections, are counter to what the data is telling us. So we have to think about, are we using the same old way in which we've done things for the last 20 years, or are we actually looking at the data? So the problems we've had is we've used unconstrained vehicle demand, using these straight line growth projections. I'm asking you all to think about that differently and challenge those demands. The design hour, we often talk about, well, we're designing for the peak 15 minutes, that's in the highway capacity manual. So we want to think about this as a city. Sometimes you end up with streets that maybe are too wide. And so thinking more broadly about whether we're designing with the 30th highest hour or designing for a typical day. In cities, we often have to think about the typical day as opposed to that, the old best case scenario that we would talk about. With the idea being the streets designed for peak intervals of traffic, thinking about that peak 15 minutes may not provide the safest and most attractive environment. There's a trade-off there that we're trying to provide. Now, as an engineer, I didn't read much until I went to Texas and learned that sociology was actually a thing in my graduate time, graduate degree, and learned from The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. And one of the quotes that I love from that book, the chapter Erosion of Cities, which of course Portland experienced that erosion in the city back in the 70s, is that the more space provided cars in the cities, the greater becomes the need for the use of cars, and hence for still more space for them. So that's part of that, what I've learned as a part of the challenging those assumptions, thinking more broadly about where do we go with our designs in the future. And part of that's performance measures. So thinking about not just that delay per vehicle, which I love to talk about, I love to think about, but making sure that we're balancing that with other measures. And one of the measures we've used in Portland is to count bike traffic over the years, and then to compare that with bicycle crashes, and see if we can see, as we build new infrastructure, see that trend go down, so that we're moving towards a more sustainable city, a safer city for people that are riding their bikes, that are walking for part of their daily travels. So this is the experience that we've had in Portland. We've been working at this for more than 20 years. And this is one of my favorite pictures of this. This is from our Broadway Bridge. And this is a normal morning commute period, where if you look at this approach to this traffic signal, there are more people on bikes. There are actually 21 people on bikes and only 9 people in their cars. So if you think about this changing dynamic, this 21st century city, how are we going to get the growth that we want in our cities, the excitement that we want in our cities? I don't have money to expand the bridge to widen for another car lane. And this 6 feet of bike space is really doing more than the 22 feet of car space in this particular example. So thinking about the growth of a city is really very important. So this is an example from Portland. I want to just leave you, with an example from New York City. They have a document called Measuring the Street, which is available online. It's a really great rethink of whether delay is still the lead story. And they talk a lot about safety and access and places. So let me just narrow in on that safety and places perspective. Of course, safety, we can measure crashes, we can change the street, change the signal timing and see if the crash experience has changed. Some of these things, I said, there's a lot that I don't know these days. Creating places is something that I'm not as familiar with, but I can think about this notion of how do we improve vitality of the street, and how do we improve the public sentiment? Do we survey people and see if they like the new configuration of the street? So of course, hopefully I've given you some thoughts about how we're thinking differently about those streets. Let me just give you an example problem that that is one of my favorites that I'd like to share, a bit about how we have made conscious engineering decisions about specific intersections. And this is a case, this is the Hawthorne Bridge. This is one of our major bridges across the Willamette River. So this is an old bridge that's been there for almost 100 years, or over 100 years. And this was it's a little bit, maybe a little bit difficult to see, but this is of course the bridge, the river's behind. This is circa 1992, so this was one of the ramps that in the bike lane, the discussion was, wait a minute, there's nobody using that bike lane. Why do we waste our time and energy striping that bike lane in? And the answer was, well, we striped it in, but it was still so dangerous to cross this on-ramp that there weren't many people using it. So we were asking, and to get to this ramp, we were asking bicycles to yield to the cars. So we had conflicts that were set up. So that's green versus the red, and then again, the green versus the red. So people biking were taking their life into their own hands to try to make that connection. And this is another picture of it. And this is the sort of change that we had to make this a viable option for people biking. There's the bike lane. It's not particularly a wide bike lane, but it's there. You see this ramp, instead of asking bikes to yield, we actually stopped the cars. And this second ramp, we eliminated this second ramp. There wasn't very much traffic, it was high-speed traffic at that. And so we said, look, that's risk that we don't need to have. It's not doing much for cars, and it's creating potential for safety problems. So we ended up eliminating that and making the traffic control different at this intersection. If there was the conflict still exists, but the cars are now stopped for the bikes that are crossing that bike lane. And so there's just another picture of it in the Google, there's that traffic that we stopped. So what happens when you stop traffic that used to be free flow on a ramp? Well, it does back up the traffic. And if I used my high capacity mail analysis, I would say that delay is lowest or receptive, that's failure. But what we're saying in Portland is that's a trade-off that we're willing to make. But the safety of the users, and the bike users in this case, are of paramount importance. And so we're making that trade-off. So I get phone calls repeatedly at this intersection saying, when are you going to do something? And the answer is, well, we don't really have the money to put up a new traffic signal. And what I tell them is, well, actually, there's another if you have a dangerous section that's too dangerous for people to use. It's very interesting, this bridge, when we opened this bridge and added the crosswalk, again, back in 1982, the discussion was, well, gosh, why'd they make it so wide? And 20 years later, after repeated efforts and adding bike facilities, now the discussion is, why didn't you make it wider? So it's sort of the build it and they will come. And part of that story is measuring and identifying over time, how have we done and how things were going and whether the city is doing the right thing. And so these things take time to grow. Of course, the story I love to tell about this is that we had this dip, and so the story in the newspaper was, what's wrong with City of Portland's bike infrastructure? Why is it falling down? And the answer is it's data. It's okay. And then we look at the data for the next few years, and it picked back up. But we do have blips in the data. That's part of research and testing. And so that's part of the story, is making sure that as you go, and you can do this at several and many intersections and many stories to tell about this. But certainly thinking about these notions of how do we make these connections that we have? How do we engineer them to be safer for people that are going through them? I do just want to add quickly a bit about technology, because it is fantastic to think about the notion of where we are going in the future and how do we get there. And so we were fortunate enough to get into the Smart City Challenge and think about this notion of how everything around us will change in the next 20 years. The one thing we know that won't change in Portland is that we'll still have the variety of users, not only the people on bikes, but the people walking, people driving, people in their cars, people on streetcar. We may have different applications to which to access the transportation system, but they'll all be available, and they may change over time. And as I think about biking, I think about Portland and our love of coffee. Some of these images that are coming out of autonomous cars just might get me inside a car. If I can get a cappuccino on my way to work by taking an autonomous car, I might get into that. Our one challenge, I will say, in Portland and many other cities, is that I may spill my cappuccino if we have a pothole and ruin my phone. So I'm really worried about that. The future of transportation is exciting. The next big thing is transporters. I know it's coming. So as students, I expect you all to, when I come back for this talk in 20 years, to be telling me about how you're working on your transporter and how you can beam me to wherever I need to go in the next years. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time, and again, congratulate Mike on a successful career, and thank you for all the relationships you've helped to create over the years. Happy to take some questions. Yes?
Well, since you said you did visit the 3rd Street and I'd like to learn a little bit about the current little battle over bridge, Rail Bridge, and whether High Bridge should be along 3rd Street. Do you have any thoughts for us, or what, if you did withdraw the street council?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. The question was about the 3rd Street Bridge. Apparently there's some discussion about a project in Moscow where there's making a connection that wasn't there before and adjacent to a residential development. Generally speaking, I don't know much about I did visit the site. I don't know much about the project, but generally I'm in support of transportation projects, especially when they complete a network. And there's a lot of discussion. One of the topics I don't talk about much, but certainly is big in the industry, is complete streets. This notion of having every mode accommodated on every street. And I tend said, well, actually, if we have two busy streets, busy arterials that maybe are not the most comfortable to cycle and walk on, maybe we'll downgrade some of those car streets for the purposes of making them better neighborhood streets that serve walking and biking and other purposes like kids playing in the streets or serving schools so that there isn't cars buzzing by the schools at too high speeds. So I think the question has to be looked at a system-wide basis. And if there are traffic congestion problems, then there is potentially a justified need if you can't make improvements elsewhere. In this case, it seems like it's a grid, so you have options, and that's the best situation to be in, is to think about what's the best use of that street versus the other streets, and will that accommodate your future growth and what your vision is for the city. So that's something that these are really important for the future of the community, and making sure that the people that more research is necessary. That's always a good answer.
Yes.
Well, your comment about wanting complete streets and wanting to have connectivity, it's a great idea. And when there is already an excellent arterial adjacent to this particular problem, which is called State Highway 8, folks, if you're going to Mountain View, when you have something like that, is it possible to protect that street and make that much more even a better arterial, and then make the neighborhood street a better neighborhood street?
That's part of that network perspective. That absolutely is thinking about what is it that you want for each individual street. In Portland, as I mentioned, we're doing a lot for bicycle traffic, and that's partly because we had never done anything for bicycle traffic when we started in the 70s. In fact, that downtown plan, I think it's mentioned maybe once or twice. And that's something that, and knowing the density of Portland as it is, and wanting to keep it, it's not New York density by any means in Portland. So for Portland, most of the trips are 4 and 5 miles. So how do we serve that best? And if we think about walking, that's a far distance to walk. So biking and transit are great ways in which to do that. So I think it's really thinking about what is the city's vision for the neighborhood, and thinking more broadly about that those arterials, are those arterials sufficient for what the growth is, and making sure that there's that opportunity to make the community more livable.
So I have a question on behalf of the students here. What things did you learn when you were in college that were important to help you become a good traffic engineer? And how has that changed over the years? And what's important now for students to learn? Is it the same things, or are there differences that you see based on your career since you were a student?
That's a great question. So the question was, what did you learn when you were an undergraduate that you used, and certainly thinking about what are the things that you're continuing to learn, and what would you have liked to have learned as an undergraduate? I think the piece of the puzzle, the nice thing about engineering is you write down the givens, you write down what's required, and then you solve the problem. So we are good at solving problems. We can, especially if they're good example problems. That's why I gave the example problems. But the challenge is when you, of course, leave the university, you don't always have that example problem. But it's the engineering process to go through to solve those problems. I think the two things that I would just point to that you could always do a better job, and I've learned a lot about this, is presenting yourself and your solutions in the most effective way possible. And part of that's being a good writer. In consulting, I did a lot more writing than I ever thought I would in engineering. In fact, I was really happy in engineering because there wasn't a lot of writing. But in the real world, you're going to end up writing a lot. And part of that being successful is writing good proposals and being an effective communicator and convincing about that you have the best idea. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is the relationship building. I think I didn't know that I was going to be working so much with people. I thought I was going to be tucked away with my spreadsheets, happy with my simulation models or what have you, and the reality is much different, especially as you ascend in your career. That's a big part of the puzzle. That's what keeps me very excited about the profession is the opportunity to make connections, to learn what other people are doing, and then try to apply it where I can. So I'm not reinventing the wheel, so I'm not solving the problems on my own. I'm using the best of a couple of different people or a couple of different cities to come up with my own solution that's based on a pretty good model and knowing that something's working. So it's obviously a fascinating time with technology, and hopefully you'll find Mike's PhD dissertation so we can share that more broadly, because it's having access to the information is really very useful. And that's something that we haven't always benefited from. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment. My husband and I visit Portland a lot, and we are bicyclists, and we always feel
Sure. I need to have you talk to my daughter about riding through Portland, because she doesn't believe me. It's very interesting. We've taken her to the Netherlands, and she's totally comfortable riding her bike without a helmet. And then the other night we were talking about, I'm going to go and maybe we can bike to your high school, just a 3-mile trip. And she said, but Dad, it's not the Netherlands here. It's a little bit less safe. And so that's, it's thinking about, again, who you're designing for, and I'm happy that you're confidently cycling around and seeing the work that we've been doing. But for perhaps the uninitiated, or even the initiated but concerned, the interested but concerned, there's still those gaps, and it all takes is one or two of those gaps to send her to the bus, which is what I did as a kid. So it's not the end of the world, certainly, but it is something that we still have work to do. So it's exciting to go and make sure that we're doing our level best to make a better city.
I like to have my students examine all of the resources that they might have, even if they're not just in Idaho or in Washington as neighbors. I think that the Project for Public Spaces of Fred Cook in New York has a great idea about designing streets. The streets are not just for cars, they're for people. And that wide range of things that people want to do in streets. Do you have any other great suggestions that the students might take a look at to enhance their connections and their relationships?
Yeah, I think you really don't have to look much further than Mike Lowry. I mean, she showed me a couple of his projects, and they were fantastic examples that are not at the scale of the Project for Public Spaces, but are best practices throughout would be best practices in the U.S. if they got greater attention. So certainly it's a tribute to his hard work and the students, spending the time to get into practical solutions, because that's something that whether you have a multi-million-dollar project or a couple $1,000s to make things better, it does take good ideas and and we've had a great partnership with Portland State to make that happen, is to take some of those ideas and put them in practice. So I continue that work and encourage the elected leadership not really on either side of it, but the data does seem to show, although there, it depends on where you